Hi everyone, and welcome to a lecture for class yesterday. Again, I apologize for not being there, but this video will cover everything that we were going to in class yesterday. During this video, we're going to take a look at Europe before the Renaissance period, and in particular look at two events, the Hundred Years' War and the Great Schism. Both of these events will set the stage for the Renaissance and really the changes that occurred during the Renaissance, moving toward a strong central government in most cases in the European nations, but also a breaking away from the church and church teachings, moving from the sacred to the secular, if you will. So we're going to start off by looking at the Hundred Years' War and looking at a little background about the Hundred Years' War. The Hundred Years' War is actually not 100 years long, first of all. It is a war that will occur off and on for around 100 years, and it really marks the end of a century of conflict between a lot of European nations. And it really is born out of the three causes listed before you on the screen. There are increasingly complex feudal contracts between the people of Europe. English kings had ruled parts of France for a few hundred years, and this caused conflict between the two monarchies. Feudalism had brought some stability to Europe, but feudalism is based on a legal contract, and it's really a delicate balance. The relationship between the lord and the vassal or the subordinate will only succeed if both parties held up their obligations. And there were very numerous forces that were at play here, causing this balance to be upset. In 1328, excuse me, the Capetian dynasty in France ended with the death of Charles IV. Now, Charles was the son of Philip the Fair, and an assembly of French nobility had given the crown to Philip, who was Charles's cousin. The English King Edward III asserted that he should be the king based on the fact that his mother had been the daughter of, or had been the granddaughter, I should say, of Philip the Fair. So, just kind of write this on a piece of paper. You have Philip the Fair at the top. Philip had a son, Charles, and then a daughter. Philip's daughter, excuse me, had a daughter who became the Queen of England, married to Edward III. This is how Edward asserted his claim to the French throne. And this is one of the primary causes of the Hundred Years' War. An English king was claiming to also be the king of France as well. Another cause of the war was economic. The French monarchy had tried to tax particularly the towns in northern Europe very heavily. And these towns in northern Europe had grown wealthy as trade and cloth making centers. Basically, they had a lot of sheep, and the English at that time were dependent on these locations to turn their sheep wool into different garments and different fabrics for trade. And so these towns in northern France were actually supportive of northern France, I should say, were actually more supportive of the English than the French because of economic ties. The last cause of the Hundred Years' War was factional conflict. By the 14th century, you had a number of individuals in the nobility who were not there because of their birth. They had money, they had wealth, and they'd been able to buy their way into nobility. On top of that, you have older nobility who were losing income due to declining taxes. declining rents, declining incomes. Some older nobility had joined forces with mercenaries to try to maintain their position in the status quo. Some nobility had married into noble family or wealthy families as a way to try to improve their situation. Whatever the case, what you have is conflict. And in order to try to be the top dog, most nobles try to join factions against other nobles in their own factions. You could have a great family, their knights, their servants, their peasant workers that have their own small army loyal to them, having sworn allegiance to them and not the king. Bottom line is, in a lot of countries, you actually had small little states that contribute to the violence of the 14th century. Now, the most pressing issue here was the status of Aquitaine. And Aquitaine was a large province in southwestern France. Now, according to feudal law, Edward III, the King of England, who we've already mentioned, held Aquitaine as part of his kingdom. Philip, claiming that it was rightfully his, had attacked the territory. Edward's response was to attack France, and this was the principal cause of the 100 Years' War. So, the French monarchy, who was supposed to be the king, economic conflict based on Flanders in the northern part of France, and factional conflict based on the nobility kind of forming their own little kingdoms inside of larger kingdoms. All these things led to the 100 Years' War. Now that's kind of the background of it. The 100 Years' War itself is actually kind of very simple to break down. It lasts from 1337 to 1453. The war itself is fought entirely on the French soil. Typically English won victories and the French won victories, and then there's a period of stalemate until conflict again rose to the surface. During those periods of stalemate or a truce, typically English and French soldiers would roam the French countryside, killing people, stealing, pretty much living off the people in the land. Most of these were mercenaries, and so they had no allegiance to anyone except whoever would give them money. And with no fighting, there was no need to pay them. It's also during the 100 Years' War that Joan of Arc becomes famous in history. In 1415, the English had won a very important battle at Agincourt, which had given them control of most of northern France. And it appeared that England would very shortly conquer all of France and unite the two countries under one crown. It's at this crucial moment in history, a young and illiterate, couldn't read or write, peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc helped to rescue France. At the age of 13, Joan believed that she had heard the voices of St. Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret bidding her to rescue the French people. Believing that God had commanded her to drive the English out of France, Joan rallied the demoralized French troops, led them into battle, and liberated France from the English at the Battle of Orleans. Ultimately, Joan was betrayed by some French who had sided with the English and imprisoned. Joan was condemned as a heretic and a witch and stood trial. Now, Joan was actually found guilty of being a witch and was sentenced to be burnt at the stake. But at the last moment, she broke down and said, "It was all a lie. I made it all up just to become famous." She eventually broke down again and said, "I didn't make any of it up. God told me to do all these things." Joan becomes a martyr, was eventually burned at the stake, and became a national hero. Joan's ability to rally France behind a common cause is what eventually will save France. Now, the war would drag on for years, and it really wasn't until 1565 that the English were actually forced out of their last foothold in France. Officially, the war ends in 1453, but they're still fighting for years after that. Now, the war itself had some impact on both England and France, and I've just listed a few of these on the screen here. For England, it devastates them financially. A lot of money was put into this war, a lot of effort was put into this war, and they lost a lot of income due to this war. A lot of the aristocratic men were killed off because they'd gone to war. A lot of children of nobility were killed off, and for more than a generation, there really wasn't wasn't a lot of nobility being born. Very few nobles in England can thus trace their lineage back before 1450, because most of them had been killed. The birth rate was low, and the population was low, and would really never, and I should say, would not recover quickly from these losses. The wool trade in Flanders was destroyed, which actually led the English to develop their own wool trade. The war also stimulated the development of the English Parliament. That met more frequently as the king required more money. And following the war, England is convulsed into the War of the Roses, which was a civil war, eventually won by Henry Tudor. Now, not listed up here, but probably most important for later English history is the fact that England was free from concern of fighting in France over English territory, and was thus able to focus their attention on overseas territories. Now in France, it still had a huge impact, but a different impact. A huge loss of life, a huge loss of farmland, because again, most of the war was fought there. The French king actually became more financially independent due to the lack of French nobility. Most of the French, and that sounds kind of funny to say, but like the English, a lot of the French nobility were killed off in the conflict, and so it allowed for the French king to more easily govern France, thus allowing them to easily collect taxes. And in a kind of a twist, while in England the king lost power, in France the king actually gained power. The Estates General, which was the English governing body, met very rarely. And so the French king grew in power as a result of this. Now, not important here, but it is important for the long-term history of France. Sons of the middle class began to enter into military service, which may not seem like a big deal, but eventually these middle class sons are going to challenge nobility for leadership of the army. And one famous son of a middle class individual who joined the military service was Napoleon Bonaparte, and we know how that worked out. So the 100 Years' War had a huge impact on England and France, but it also had a huge impact on Europe, as it really set the stage for future encounters between these two nations, and really where their strength would lay going forward. France would have the benefit of, for the most of the early modern European period, of having a strong army. England would develop a very strong navy because they could focus on that more so than having to deal with France. So that's the 100 Years' War in a nutshell. Next, we're going to move on and talk about the Great Schism, the other big event of pre-Renaissance Europe. Now, for the Great Schism, we need to kind of set the stage and set the background. The Great Schism was a power struggle that had been going on between the popes and the kings of Western Europe for some time now, and it really comes to a head during the Great Schism. It comes to a head during the reign of Philip the Fair of France and Pope Boniface VIII, and the dispute really was over who was in charge. Was the Pope ultimately in charge, or were the kings of Western Europe ultimately in charge? And they quarreled over several issues. One was the right to tax. And in this case, Philip wanted to tax the French clergy. Philip needed more money. The church is really rich, so let's tax them. Boniface said, no, you have no right to do that. They are clergy. And so I'm the only one that can tax the French clergy. You have no right to. Boniface threatened to excommunicate any leader who tried to tax clergy without his consent. And so Philip simply stopped exporting French coinage out of France, which kept the church in France from sending any money to Rome. That's a lot of money, so eventually Boniface backs down and the king is able to collect taxes. The second event that happens is some intrigue. Philip tried to arrest a French bishop for treason. The bishop had actually tried to start a rebellion against the king, and so he had good reason to arrest him. The Pope protested. The clergyman can only be tried under church law in a church court, regardless of what he had done. Philip reacted by putting together a pamphlet, questioning the Pope, questioning his piety, his moral character, his fitness to rule. All over the arrest of a French bishop. And this goes on and on and on and on. It finally comes to a head when Boniface threatens to excommunicate Philip. Most Frenchmen, even French clergymen, sided with the king in this. By this point in time, the papacy had lost most of its moral prestige. Folks were typically more loyal to government, and so they didn't really care what the Pope said. Philip responded to Boniface's edict of excommunication by announcing that Boniface was a heretic, a criminal. He learned that Boniface was staying in northern Italy. He sent French troops to kidnap Boniface and to bring him back to Paris to stand trial. The French military actually captured Boniface, but when they discovered he was too ill to travel, they let him go. So the Pope returned to Rome, but he was so humiliated by the experience that he died shortly thereafter. This will begin a period of French domination of the church and set the stage for the Great Schism. So after the death of the Pope, excuse me, it really was if Philip had been successful in having Boniface tried for a heretic or criminal and having him found guilty. 2 years after Boniface's death, a French archbishop is elected cardinal. The archbishop not only excused Philip, but also praised him for bringing charges against Boniface. The new Pope, Clement V, never went to Rome, but instead moved his headquarters to Avignon, which is in southern France. It would remain there up until 1377 under heavy French influence. This period is called the Babylonian captivity of the church, and during this period papal prestige is going to suffer enormously. Most people in Christianity at the time believed that Rome was the only suitable capital for the church. Moreover, the English, the Germans, and the Italians accused the popes and the cardinals, who were also French, of simply being pawns or instruments of the French king. The Avignon papacy added fuel to the fires of those critics who were attacking church corruption, papal claims of authority, and really the lack of spiritual dedication. The Avignon popes continued to expand their papal bureaucracy, added new church taxes, collected the old taxes more efficiently, and really began to live a secular lifestyle, which led to demands for reform. Finally, in 1377, out of popular opinion, the church returned to Rome, and it seemed that for a time the fortunes of the church would improve. However, the reverse was actually the truth. In 1378, a new papal election was held, and the College of Cardinals elected an Italian pope. Well upset over this, the French cardinals declared the election invalid and elected a French pope, who returned to Avignon. The church was now even in a worse situation, because now you have two popes, both claiming papal authority. During this great schism, you had the church split into two allegiances. Excuse me. Each had their own College of Cardinals. Each had their own capital. Each claimed universal sovereignty. Each tried to collect tithes. Tried to excommunicate each other. And really the nations of Europe were at a loss as to what to do, so most of them swore an allegiance to one pope or the other based on their own national interests. In order to keep these allegiances, the popes had to make concessions to keep allies and largely abandon the practice of interfering in national politics. So actually withdrew from national politics to focus on the church. This schism continued after the original rival popes died. Each camp simply elected a replacement instead of trying to heal the schism within the church. Religious life, of course, is going to suffer. Each part of Christendom, each part of the church was denouncing each other, and people are asking, who's saved? There's so much doubt and confusion causing questions to the legitimacy and really the holiness of the church as an institution. You know, how do I know if I'm saved? If they can't even decide who's in charge of the church, how do you know who is saved? Finally, a movement began called the Conciliar movement. It first began in 1395. It really took form in 1409 when a general council was called to try to resolve the dispute. Both sides agreed to the council. They met in Pisa. They actually got rid of both the popes and elected a new one. The problem was the people they got rid of wouldn't give up office. And so now you have three people claiming to be pope. This called for another church council, this time by the Holy Roman Emperor in 1414. This time, in an interesting twist, voting took place on a national basis. Instead of the traditional assembly of bishops, the council included lay representatives and was organized as a convention of nations. Germany, Italy, France, and English. Each nation had one vote. So basically, all the people from the nation had to agree on who to vote for. Finally, Martin V was elected as Pope in 1417. The Great Schism ended, and a single papacy was restored, but not without leading to even bigger changes. Even before the Great Schism, there had been questions about the need for reform within the church. This movement, this conciliar movement, had represented the reforming and democratizing influence in the church, aimed at transforming the papacy into more along the lines of a limited monarchy, really a figurehead. The problem was that this didn't last very long, as the people who were elected simply refused to make any changes. So but even before this, throughout the 14th century, the cries against church corruption were louder and louder. Really, the question for most people was, who was the Pope trying to be the successor of, Peter or Caesar? The sacred or the secular? What was their ultimate goal? This corruption, as some saw within the church, provided the impetus for church reformers. Two individuals I just want to briefly mention. One was John Wycliffe. John was a professor at Oxford College who not only attacked church abuses but also church doctrine. John Wycliffe believed that the church should be subordinate to the state, that salvation was an individual matter between God and human beings, and that outward rituals and the veneration of relics was idolatrous. Wycliffe has been called by many the forerunner of the Reformation. He formed bands of poor priests called Lollards who spread his views and actually provided people with an English translation of the Bible, which he considered the final authority in all matters of religions. Not his translation, but the Bible itself. And although Wycliffe's demands for reform did not succeed, the Lawlers began to spread a more radical version of Wycliffe's ideas until the movement was eventually driven underground the next century. But they had done their job. They had started people talking. In Germany, another individual, John Huss, was also very tired of church abuse and reform, or church abuses and of power. Huss attacked the abuse of clerical power, and this led him to conclude that the true church was composed of a universal priesthood of believers, and that Christ alone was the head, not the Pope. The church actually excommunicated Huss, alarmed by his growing influence. Huss actually was tricked into coming out into the open and burned at the stake. After Huss's death, his remaining followers eventually merged with the Lutheran movement in frustration with a church deaf to their protests. John Huss did not want to separate from the Catholic Church, nor did his followers. He simply wanted them to reform, but they did not do that. Both the schism and this conciliar movement had exposed the need for ecclesiastical reform, thus laying the foundation for the great reform efforts of the 16th century. So what you see here in both the Renaissance and the Great Schism are the setting of the stages for, I should say the 100 Years' War and the Great Schism are setting the stages for the Renaissance and the Reformation, which we're going to look at in the next few weeks. This is, in some sense, the end of what we call medieval Europe and the emerging of a more modern Europe, coming out of the Middle Ages into a time of discovery and innovation. As a reminder, tomorrow you will have a short quiz over this lecture video, so be prepared. Pay particular attention to the main points as outlined here in this presentation. If you have any questions, please email me tonight or in the morning. Come by my office and we'll talk about it. Hope you guys have a good evening. God bless.